I love it.
If there is one thing I love more than movies, it's the history of the Second World War. Ever since I was a youngster, I've been drawn to stories about World War II, whether it's in books or in cinema. Hell, I've even written a historical fiction novel that takes place at the end of World War II. It's available on Amazon. Shameless plug. So, needless to say, when a film comes out that takes place during the Second World War, well, I'm naturally drawn to it. And the amount of movies taking place during this time period, they're too numerous to mention. Now, this is where I would normally mention a few films in the genre, but I'd literally be here all day doing that. So let's just say it's a ton. Now, that's not to say that all of these films are great or even good. There have been many films that take place in this time period that are, well, they're not very good. Now, back on January 1st in Great Britain, the movie One Life was released. And I saw a couple of reviews of it, and it intrigued me. Now, anyone who has Twitter, or really any social media site, has probably seen the old video from a British television show in the 80s of the old man sitting in the audience who was unknowingly surrounded by the grown-up children or grandchildren of the people he helped save from the Nazis in World War II. It's a pretty powerful video. Now, the man in the video's name is Nicholas Winston. And the movie One Life is, well, it's based on his life. Now, this past weekend saw the release of this movie in the United States. And while it's a bit hard to find because of limited release, I was able to see it Friday night. So what do we have here? Is One Life a movie that can be added to the impressive list of movies about events in World War II? Or is it something that is uninspiring and forgettable? Well, before we answer that, let's talk a little bit about the plot to the movie One Life.
Let's talk.
So here we find 29-year-old stockbroker Nicholas Winston visiting Czechoslovakia in 1938, just weeks after the Munich Agreement was signed, which gave Hitler control of parts of Czechoslovakia. He encounters families in Prague who have fled the rise of the Nazis, both in Germany and Austria and in this part of Czechoslovakia. Most of these families are Jewish. They are living in poor conditions with little or no shelter or food and in fear of invasion. Now, actively supported by his mother Babette, here played by the always wonderful Helen Bonham Carter, he overcomes bureaucratic hurdles, collects donations, and looks for foster families for the children to be brought to England. A race against time begins as it is unclear how long the border will remain open before the inevitable Nazi invasion. Now, 50 years later in 1988, Winston, now in his 70s, cleans up some of the clutter in his office in which his wife had asked him to do. He finds his old documents in which he recorded his work from back in Czechoslovakia at the outbreak of World War II with photos and lists of the children him and his group wanted to save. Winston still blames himself for not being able to save everyone. The movie flashes back and forth between Winston in the early days of World War II and Winston trying to move forward with his life 50 years later. So as usual, let's start with the acting. Anthony Hopkins plays old Winston and actor Johnny Finn plays the younger version. Now, both performances are wonderful. I mean, what more needs to be said about Hopkins at this point? The man's a literal living legend and one of the greatest actors who have ever lived. His heartfelt and earnest performance is astonishing. Playing the older Winston with such understatement and humanity, it's hard to believe that the 86-year-old actor can still turn in such a performance. He delivers a brilliant performance here as a regretful man who has dedicated his life to service but can't escape the specter that he could have done more. But to me, it's Johnny Flynn who really shines. I'm not overly familiar with him, but he's a revelation here. Young Winston is really just a wealthy stockbroker whose life has been mostly separated from traumatic events. And watching Flynn take him from this to naive idealist to a man driven to save as many children as possible is a masterclass in acting. And as I mentioned, Helen Bonham Carter, who plays Winston's mother, she's always great. I really think both men perfectly capture the story of an ordinary man who did extraordinary things to save the lives of as many innocent children as he possibly could. Showing us that sometimes it's the smallest of us, the most nondescript, that could have the biggest impact. But that it takes more than nice words to do this. It takes actual work. There is no virtue signaling here. One Life it's a bit of a slow burn. It slowly establishes Winston's modest character as a younger and as an older man. But when it cracks open, it is a deeply moving portrait of true human goodness. Also, I have to praise the filming of the iconic scene that I mentioned earlier. It hit so much harder watching it play out on the big screen with Hopkins, playing Winston. The emotionality of the entire thing will touch the hearts of even the coldest and most cynical among us.
Warms my cold, dead heart.
Look, this isn't a set the world on fire film. It's a bit slow at times. It's not overly dramatic despite the premise. It's very conventional. There's nothing new in it. But when it works, it's inspiring. And it works much more often than it doesn't. This wonderful, heartfelt, understated film about an ordinary man doing the best he can in an almost impossible situation where there was really never a chance of complete success, but still doing all he can to save as many as he could, is a worthy addition to the many great films made about the Second World War. You probably won't get to see this in the theaters as it's under limited release, but see it you should as soon as it's available.
You must see it.
Well, that's it for me this week. Tune in next week when I talk about whatever I've seen. And in the meantime, click that like button, subscribe, leave a comment, share this video with friends and enemies alike. And as always, thank you for giving me your valuable time, and I'll see you next week. Take care.